Hello, everyone. This is Brian Herr. I'll be your presenter today. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to make their way in as we've now started to make the session live. Just a little bit of housekeeping as we go. If you have questions along the way, please drop them in the chat. We want this to be an interactive and helpful session. Also note that this will be recorded, so others may be able to reference the material a little bit later. And then, as always, if you have questions after the session, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help. And with that, we'll give it one more minute. Okay. At this point, we've let everybody make their way in. Those that make their way after this point can catch up on the recording or can catch up along with questions. And with that, we're going to go ahead and open it up. So really quickly here, the whole objective is to help people in the industry and out in the world understand really the whole journey to CMMC. So it's really a three-part series where we take you through basically a journey of understanding what does the CMMC program look like for you as an organization. You know, what have we learned from our customers? What have we learned when it comes to helping people get to this point from a program at high level? And then the next sessions will get more into a little bit more detail of what kind of products and solutions are being used. And then the final session will be more of pulling it all together. Basically a day in the life of creating a CMMC ready environment. Making our way through, let's talk a little bit about my background. I've been in the industry a little over 28 years. I got my start back when the NISPOM was the hot topic to talk about when it came to protecting federal data. During that time, I've been supporting multiple organizations, especially the service provider space, with hundreds of end customers. And as we made our way through, I've also gained a lot of experience helping to build and run organizations around incident response, active recovery advisory, do quite a bit of speaking engagements, I do board advisory, and ultimately I get paid to talk about this stuff and help educate everyone so that you can learn from what I've had the experience of gaining without having to go through all the trials and tribulations yourself. So let's talk a little bit about the CMMC journey. At this point, CMMC should not be news. The first version of it came about in 2020, and the origination of the whole idea really goes back to 2010. You know, the idea being that the federal government is trying to protect controlled unclassified data, sometimes called CUI, sometimes called CUI. This is different than classified data, but does need to be controlled. And it started with an executive order and then into FISMA and everything else. But ultimately, the idea of protecting CUI has been around and enforced for greater than a decade. The DoD, being in the space that it is, decided to step up the program with DFARS 252-204-7012. And with that, basically making it mandatory that there is a program and a self-attestation that is reported that your organization, if it is utilizing CUI, is meeting the controls laid out in NIST SP 800-171. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. Having CUI doesn't mean it's DoD. It does not mean it's Defense Department. You can have other federal CUI from other agencies that still comes under 800-171, which is the protecting and safeguarding of controlled unclassified information. The DoD has stepped it up and said, we need a way to do an attestation to start enforcing that these controls, these safeguards are in place. Over time, what the DoD found is that different organizations had different levels of maturity because there wasn't a mandatory score. The whole idea was the higher the score, that the agency or the primes, the prime contractors to those agencies, would choose organizations with a higher score. That didn't necessarily play out. And what the DoD found is when it came to looking at some of these organizations, there are certain things that just weren't adding up. In other words, doing a self-attestation, you relied on the proficiency and understanding of the organization itself to do the self-assessment, and whoever they've picked to be an auditor, the scores can vary. There's sometimes the controls are not implemented or not fully implemented. So in those cases, more of a check the box or the coverage wasn't complete. And because, some of those organizations just weren't trained auditors, they didn't necessarily think about the implications and what it meant to being and meeting the requirements of 800-171. So coming out of that, the DoD stepped back and said, we need a program to have qualified trainer, basically a whole ecosystem of trainers, practitioners, assessors, the list goes on. That came about with the CMMC, and under version 1, it was going through the process and there was a lot of feedback. And ultimately that feedback caused a bit of a pivot. The DoD stepped back and said, okay, let's go ahead and create a version 2. Version 2, that's where we're at today. So version 2 has gone through and has been submitted for comment, and ultimately is what is trending to be the official go live of this journey. And the biggest thing to think about is it mandates that there is a third-party assessor, a C3PAO, certified third-party assessment organization, that is doing an assessment. Many of us would think of it as an audit, but they are doing a validated, well understood audit of the environment to that criteria, at which point that assessment would generate a certificate, basically a set of findings. And from there, if there's a pass, then it would, in theory, become a certification. Now, on that journey, things have we're getting to the end of that journey. There's a lot that goes into getting something like CMMC instituted by the DoD within the federal government and then adopted by the defense industrial base. We know that based on what we're seeing and how things are progressing, it will be going live in 25. The reality is, in 25, we're expecting March is the expectation. It might drift a little bit, but ultimately around Q1 or early Q2 of 25, that the CMMC version 2.0 will become live. So what kind of leads up to that? February this year, the Title 32 went to public comment. That's finished. We're expecting Title 48 to finish out March, April this year. The next CMMC town hall will cover some of that. Which, by the way, if you are wondering how some of us in the practitioner space keep up with a lot of these announcements and some of the we'll call it very relevant industry knowledge, visit the CMMC AB, especially the town halls. The link is on the bottom of the slide. There's a monthly town hall where practitioners and very knowledgeable experts in the industry speak about what is happening with the CMMC, the progress, and the expectations. Now, right now, in that March, April timeframe, we're expecting Title 48 should be closing fairly soon. Things will go to review and public comment, basically go through the process. In order for the requirement of, since this Congress put in the provisional rule, this Congress has to approve the final rule, which means this whole thing has to be done, if it's going to make it into 25, before Congress adjourns in December of this year. So in order for that to happen, there has to be a review period, which is a few months, and that puts us in October. So we're expecting to see the final publication go up for review by Congress in October. If that happens and it goes to review by the end of December, if it's going to pass, it will pass, and then we're expecting it to go live in 2025. What makes us really think this is going to come to fruition is that we're already seeing a surgence of DoD direct contractors, so often called primes. They're going through a joint surveillance voluntary assessment program. In other words, because they know that this is probably going to be in place and it will take time to get certified, the idea is that they would voluntarily go through an assessment led by a C3PAO, and would be against the current 800-171 controls. And at the end, if they pass with all the criteria, then when the certification becomes available, it would be able to pivot and then become a valid certification. That is only open to those that are directly contracted with the DoD, and there is a waiting list. There's only, I think, a little over 100 at this point that have been through it. I think there's another 200 or 300 that are in line, but that doesn't address the rest of the defense industrial base, core tech included. Because of where we work, we are contracting with a C3PAO and basically getting our spot in line for 2025, making sure our program is ready so that once it becomes available, we can start the assessment process and a final certification in 2025. One thing to note is through this process, there's something that's come about that not everyone thought about early on. Is if your organization depends on an external service provider, an MSP, MSSP, SOC providers, consulting companies, anybody that would have basically access to systems with data or security data in your environment, they become part of your organization when it comes to this audit. In other words, they fulfill specific controls or parts of controls as part of a shared responsibility matrix. This adds a certain intricacy people didn't expect. That means if you are going to go for a certification, your ESPs must already be certified to the same or a higher grade of CMMC. The reason I bring that up is there's not a lot of time left, and not everyone in their CMMC preparedness, they didn't really think through that part and didn't account for those service providers on whether, one, they would have the certification, and two, when would it happen if they are going for it? And if they're not going to go for it, do you have a plan to migrate to another service provider? These are things that people didn't think about. Now, coming through all of this, you're going to see more and more people really trying to figure out, how do I get ready to be certified? The reality is 800-171 has gone through revisions, but it's still based on some of the same controls. If your program had been functioning and working correctly, it really is just making sure and being very strict about the interpretation and getting that pre-assessment. If you have any doubts that your internal assessments and your self-attestations, it just isn't to the quality or caliber that you believe the CMMC, C3PAO, or external auditor is going to assess you against, there's not a lot of runway left. I would recommend definitely engaging with an assessor for a pre-assessment to really get an understanding of where you're at, because you can see, it seems like 2025 is far away, but when you really think about it, we're down to counting months, and then eventually we're going to be down to counting weeks until it goes live. And the result is once it goes live, the DoD will start putting CMMC certification requirements as part of the CUI flowdowns. In other words, they will be calling out what CUI, what CMMC level is required, those kinds of things for new contracts. Existing contracts, they should, based on everything I've seen, should continue as is. What I will say that is an interesting trend is we're getting a lot of discussions with those in the defense industrial base, especially those that are primes on contracts or maybe second tier, where they're already questioning their subsequent service providers or anyone in their ecosystem, as part of that. Where are you at in your CMMC journey? And many of them are being asked to do a third-party assessment now, so that for critical components within the defense industrial base in that supply chain, people don't want surprises. So we're starting to see the rumblings of looking for a third-party attestation today against 800-171, so that the primes have an idea of which contractors really will be there and be able to take and get their CMMC certification. We're getting asked by the primes of if some of the subs have actually scheduled or at least retained a C3PAO for their final assessment, and if they are actively working a program to address any gaps to make sure that that assessment goes smoothly. So this is very different. It is a very engaged industry. So things have moved from it could happen to it should happen to it will happen to it is now happening, and the pressures are real. So looking at the big picture, this is probably one of the biggest topics when I sit down and really talk with some of our customers and partners and even the C3PAOs that we've partnered with over the years. And the reason being is at the end of the day, people tend to really blow out of proportion what all comes under the scope of CMMC. I have a phrase where I say, if you don't scope properly, eventually you'll be trying to find a CMMC compliant internet, and there isn't one. The root of the whole idea of CMMC, this whole program really, is the federal government looking to protect its CUI. That's it. It is an attempt to keep CUI out of the hands that shouldn't have it. Why do I bring that up? Many people that have been in the industry, we're familiar with something like a PCI audit. So as soon as you say PCI audit, what does everyone think? They think, oh my goodness, I'm going to put a PCI enclave together so that I can limit the scope. Doesn't mean I'm not going to do good security everywhere, but for the scope of everything that goes into that PCI environment, I make a little enclave. I make a bubble that's very tight, neat, segmented. It's off by itself. It is very secure. I know how it operates. It's very, very regimented. That's how you need to think about CMMC. People tend to think about it in such broad terms. Now, when I talk about that, you have to first understand what's the data that you get and what are the business processes that use it? Which individuals and systems does it reside? Does it flow through? And then the next piece is what level of the organization. This is probably one of the hottest topics. You have to look at your organization. Is your entire organization dedicated to doing business within the defense industrial base? If that's true, then yes, you will make a very succinct CMMC set of rules and a program. But in that case, depending on where that data flows, it may be very prolific through your environment, at which point the entire organization would come under a CMMC program, and all of your systems and data and business processes, anything that CUI flows through becomes part of that audit scope, part of that CMMC program. So I see this often with defense contractors. Uh, that's their entire business. So the entire environment ends up sitting in GovCloud or GCC High or what have you. So the idea is I built the whole environment to that standard. Now, the next piece that I often see, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, is I'll see a commercial entity that maybe has a business unit or a wholly owned subsidiary that is doing, federal contracts or is part of the defense industrial base. In that case, it doesn't make sense to apply CMMC and GovCloud standards to the entire organization. It makes sense to scope it down specifically to that business unit, maybe to that subsidiary, because they act basically like a self-sufficient business, and the things that don't have CUI are outside of that environment. That's fine, no problem, because ultimately we care about the CUI. We care about protecting that federal data. Don't go outside of those bounds. Don't let things bleed out. This is one of those exercises where I talk to people about creating a boundary and access diagram of the environment. What data do you have? What are the process systems and people that fit in it? How do you gain access in? What comes out? How are you protecting that CUI? The last one is kind of an interesting one. Sometimes the use of that federal data is so niche and so specific, it doesn't even flow through an entire business unit. It might be very specific people or a very specific team. At which point you have to look at that team and go, is this your dedicated job? At which point you have full-time access? Or is it just part-time? In other words, when you're working on those projects, I need access to that data. And this is where we see a lot of times people doing more of an enclave. So it's a completely contained environment. Everything you need to do your job, everything's right there. And then either part-time or full-time, those specific team members go in, access the data, work on stuff. And then from there, everything about the CMMC requirements stay contained. And with containment comes easier to control, easier to implement, easier to manage. Also, it's easier to scope and audit, both as internal process, but also as part of a external or C3PAO process. It saves a lot of headaches as well as a lot of time, money, and effort. And I bring this up.
We had a question come through the chat, which was, what is the most effective way to identify where my environment is susceptible or not to CMMC? Are there tools or lightweight assessments that can identify where our CUI lives? And you might be getting that later in the presentation. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. The best way to think of it is this. If you come under a program that has CUI, it is supposed to be called out to you as part of that data handoff and as part of the contracting process. So an example would be, I know of a engineering firm that as part of the contracting process, the prime contractor to the DoD lays out as part of that package, here's the specific document types, data, drawings. They call out contract data, federal contract data. They basically list out everything that they would consider that kind of data. And then they also lay in there how they tag it. Some people use in-document tags. Some organizations use digital tags. But that's what's supposed to happen as part of the flow down. Now, if you have a contract that calls out FARs, DFARs, anything about handling of CUI, you need to go back and make sure that that data is called out and go back to that contractor and ask for an inventory. And they are supposed to provide it because they are also held responsible. That's one thing that's very, very key here is the responsibility. It's cumulative. So they can't pass responsibility to the sub. The prime holds on to some of the responsibility because they will be held responsible if there is an issue of their subsidiary organizations. The next piece would be, once you understand the tagging or the formats or maybe the flow of that data, sometimes it comes in via email, maybe it comes through APIs or some app integration. Most organizations will have a way to basically catalog. Some do it manually. Some will use a data mapping or data detection platform, maybe a data loss prevention platform repurposed. But ultimately, there's a number of platforms out there that you give them the criteria of the data. Maybe it's based on tags, file types. There's a lot of different criteria you can put into the system. And then from there, you search the environment. This is where it becomes very important to understand what data you have and where it is so that you can quantify and reduce your search domain to be more effective. Otherwise, it can take an extended amount of time. And that actually leads into the next point. What I found is when it comes to a program like this and understanding CUI, you not only have to understand what data you have, where it is, but also, are there any third parties that can act upon the systems or data in your environment? Or do you pass that data downstream to anyone? At which point you have an obligation as part of the contracting process to describe and tag and identify clearly and track the data that you are sending downstream. That's something that may be overlooked in some organizations. Some are much better about tracking it than others. But you have a right to go back to whoever you're contracting with and look at those contracts and then validate that there is some kind of mechanism that they're identifying the data. Once it's identified, it's on your organization to keep tabs on it and to find it. And I recommend, there are some great tools out there. There are some that use DLP products. There's a whole host of DLP products. We can do a whole other session on that. But there are automated means. Once you understand what the data looks like, you can find it. One of the mysteries that people kind of go through is, well, what do I type in to find CMMC data? There's no magic. There's no one identifier that exists on all CUI, all the control data. This is where you have to know your data. And sometimes it does, once you get examples of that data, it may be a strategic item to make your life easier to engage a third-party company that understands how to search environments at scale for specific data types. And there are whole organizations, that's all they do. Does that help out, Colin?
Yeah, I think that answered it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So the next piece, this is one of those items that some people, it's almost shocking. When we talk about protecting CUI, most people jump to IT and technology and cybersecurity and everything that goes with that. That's only part of the equation. Protecting CUI, it's a multifaceted approach. It is a business process. And what most people don't think about is there's an administrative side to protecting that business, where there's people. It involves compliance and audit people, whether internal or external. IT and data security, they're definitely involved. Your risk team, if you don't have a risk team, maybe they fold up under another organization. And then the one organization people don't think about is HR. Your HR team has to be part of this. There's going to be the creation of processes and governance of those processes and policies. There's going to be a risk management program that's part of the requirements. There's documentation and training. There's reporting of the program to leadership team, progress, understanding the business processes of where is CUI being handled, what's being affected, what happens if you need to do the entire item here. The protection of CUI is a business need, and it's more than just laying it on top of a IT to try to get past an audit. And this is often the areas where people seem to miss on having the right head count, getting the right partners in place, because not everyone's going to be able to have the expertise to do the, any internal ongoing audits, setting up policies. Really, the success of a program, it comes down to the administrative side first and foremost. And if you don't have experience here, there are partners in the ecosystem. There are partners out there right now that are in the CMMC marketplace that can help you with this. CoreTech is partnered with many of those organizations, and there's some of that we can provide as well. My biggest advice is find your partners now, because you will save a lot of time and effort by getting these items addressed up front, because once they're addressed, you can move on to the security side. This is the stuff people tend to think about. Hardening of the environment, hardening of machines, making sure that you have cyber resilience and detection, incident response processes, technologies, people, all the right security tools, platforms, being able to report on compliance within your technology landscape, understanding configuration drift. These are very technical aspects. Not every organization is ready to handle that. So the biggest thing there is get your partners lined up and really look at holistically. I have to look at my program from administrative, people, process, and everything else. And I have to look at it from more tactical, looking at security and all the technologies and pieces that go into it. I always bring that up here because if you're not thinking about all those pieces, you will have a surprise when you go through the process. And this is probably the one area that often surprises people when they're not used to the CMMC space or the highly regulated space in general. So let's talk through it a little bit. When we're talking about the path to CMMC, it really looks like a journey of maturing an organization. The first thing that has to happen, understand, and this is going to sound repetitive, but it's very important. What data do you have? Where is it? What are the business processes and systems that use it? And then pick your scope. Am I doing a CMMC program for a team? Maybe I put that into an enclave. Is it a business unit at which I do a smaller environment based on standards? Or am I doing a much larger organization? Well, that's a bigger undertaking. And that really does change the way I have to scope time, effort, money, resources, and human resources. So that's the first thing I tell people. You need to get your house in order. What is it you are protecting and what's the scope? The next thing is get a true, honest, third-party pre-assessment. What I've found historically is that when I go through internal assessments, so self-assessments, that the experience of the person doing the assessment will shine through in the results. And if you've ever watched, a match between professionals and amateurs, it becomes very clear the discrepancies in skills, aptitude, and just the breadth of knowledge. And you'll find the same thing. Now, that's not true of all organizations. Some organizations have excellent practitioners on staff, and their self-assessments are top-notch. But not all of them. And you have to sort out where your self-assessment lies. And you need to be honest with yourself, because you cannot fix what you do not know. And having that show up as a surprise at the final assessment, there's not enough time left to be able to have surprises like that. The next piece is, if you're going to do that assessment, you're going to have to really be able to give a detailed overview and architecture of your technology landscape and your processes. Really, you're going to bear all about your program to that pre-assessment firm. Realize the idea isn't to try to pass the pre-assessment. The idea is to bear everything to that organization, that pre-assessment consultant, so that they can find any and all gaps, maybe even in the minutia, because you want to go into the final assessment prepared. And then coming out of that, you're going to get some of the gaps. You're going to understand the gaps, and you have to be very honest with yourself and say, is this something that I have the time, money, and duration, in other words, time until the CMMC goes live? And I bring that up because some organizations, as they go through that pre-assessment, they get this gap list, and what they find is there's too much here to be taken on by their teams alone, or with the technology they have. Or maybe they've set the scope way too large, and after going through the assessment, the advisement is to actually shrink the scope down to something very specific. This all takes someone who is heading up the program and thinking strategically on behalf of the organization. So once you have that understanding of what is the present, what is now, if you haven't done it already, you really need to be talking with your registered practitioner organizations, your partner organizations, your C3PAOs, your pre-assessment. There's an ecosystem, and I always tell people, this is a small community. We work here at Cortec with several of the C3PAOs directly, because we're very well known for this space, and especially when it comes to building highly secure, high compliance, and CMMC ready environments in Azure.
So Brian, there's another question that came through that I think is a good time to kind of address this is, okay, what is an enclave in the context of CMMC, and how do you, I'm adding this part, how do you differentiate between if you need, or if it would be most beneficial to just build an enclave, in an Azure environment versus, having to layer CMMC over your entire existing business and infrastructure? And thirdly, knowing this space a little bit, if you do have to do it over your entire business, how do you analyze whether you should try to apply the controls to your current environment, or maybe consider migrating your entire environment to a pre-built CMMC compliant enclave?
Yeah, you boiled a couple of them in there. I think I got it. This is really good timing. So when you go through that assessment and you get the gaps, you're going to get an understanding of what those gaps look like. And what I will tell you is based on Cortec's experience, and actually after talking with others in the industry, when you try to fix in place, you have to expect it will take between 12 and 24 months to go through the process. And we see about 50-50 shot on whether it actually completes, because fixing in place is very difficult. Many things can break. What we found is that there's so many sins of the past often buried in environment, that tribal knowledge may not exist, that specialty configuration, or in general, something that was made to work in a very specific way may not work once it is tuned or hardened or configured to a baseline. And in those cases, it's often very impactful to the organization to do those hardening changes to a live environment, because if it does break something, go through a testing period, and then you have to roll back. What we found is that, one, for smaller groups like teams or smaller organizations, having an enclave, and what we define as an enclave, is very much a self-sufficient, ready-built environment. So usually, in our world, because we do a lot with Microsoft, it's a combination of Microsoft tools, platforms, Azure, Office 365, all of it set up for GovCloud, hardened to the requirements of CMMC. with all the right reporting structure controls in place, using software and platforms that already have a federal authorization to operate. It is a very turnkey, ready to go environment. And from there, you have a very secure, stable, and compliant platform which to migrate users or systems or data into that bubble, that contained environment, that CMMC enclave. And a migration effort oftentimes yields better success because you're not bringing a previous set of issues into a new clean environment. Oftentimes people will build their applications or their data processes net new in the environment. It usually takes less time than trying to fix whatever they have in place. And it becomes part of a transformational program, which people tend to have more aptitude and desire to really push into. Now, can you migrate some systems that were previously set up in a specific way and fix in place? We do see that, a little bit of mixture. Maybe you've got some legacy servers that need an exception because of the way they operate. Okay, moving that over and doing a cutover test is less business impacting than trying to roll hardening and changes in place. Because if there's a problem, you can roll back to the previous, make your changes, and then migrate back. Whereas if it's a wholesale change, it's an entire process to roll back major configuration changes. The next piece is if your entire organization comes under this envelope, we've usually seen that there's enough legacy tech baggage or technical debt that doing a cloud migration coupled with an Office 365 migration, which is a known repeatable process, a validated process that's been done tens of thousands of times in the world, across all the Microsoft partners. That is a known process. Doing that known migration process to a secured, compliant, stable, ready to go environment often has less business impact than trying to address basically the sins of the past. And this is anecdotal, right? But it's based on a lot of years of experience of trying to do this. And talking to our peers, we see the same thing. Most organizations are just taking it as this is the time to move to a platform that's ready, that embraces the compliance and security natively, and all of that can be done in a way that's already a proven design architecture. And then from there, because it's proven, you can lean on the industry, you can lean on other organizations that have experience. We do a lot within the Microsoft ecosystem. So we can do the compliance and IT and security, not only implementation, but the ongoing management as well. And that's a huge offset. So that kind of gets to the rest of the slide is in order to get to that type of environment, especially in a shortened period of time, you can't be patchworking in different solutions and platforms and objects and software. And you need to build the environment as much as a ready to go ecosystem, already tried and true design and architecture, versus fix in place if you have a fair amount of gaps. Now, if your organization is already on top of it and there's only a handful of gaps, they're not major, fix in place, move on. But historically, I don't run into those organizations very often. Most really run into the only way this is going to be feasible, especially if they're a larger organization and do it at scale, is to migrate into an environment. During that migration, they operate in a hybrid model. So what they do is everything that's moving into that CMMC ready environment or into that CMMC enclave is adopting as much coverage as it can by getting into that environment and then being rebuilt or transitioned in. Things that are outside the environment, there's a certain amount of fix in place that you can do. Those gaps are then put on your POAM, so plan of action and milestones, and that's all part of your program and helping you assess the risk of what items move from hybrid over to the dedicated environment. Now, a lot of people tend to confuse hybrid here with cloud or not cloud. That's not it. We're talking basically, because you can have your CMMC environment, and like we do a lot with Azure, in Azure, but then your Azure tools and policies and controls and software, all of that is centralized, and it can actually reach in and do management of systems that are on site, so that you have one domain that is under your CMMC umbrella. The other piece that comes up is when you're looking at whether to fix in place or move to one of these enclaves, right, or move my organization, is how long do I have, right? If it's a few items, okay, I can go ahead and address it. If I have a lot of items, fixing in place might take 2 years. Well, things are going to start going live in 2025. Your runway's running short. So you have to balance some of those items out. Once you get to the point of, I understand my gaps, I have my road to success, I am either fixing in place or I am migrating to a ready to go environment, the next piece would be, how do I maintain this? We talked about earlier, not all organizations have the skill sets for this, especially when it comes to the heightened requirements around IT and security and monitoring and things of that nature. This is where having a CMMC ready service provider is essential. We're seeing more organizations push that way, but we mentioned earlier, look at, if you have service providers now, make sure that they're on par and going through the CMMC program, because they're going to have to be certified before you can go for your certification, which is the last step. You've done your pre-assessment, you're ready to go, you've come back to the clean bill of health, you've at this point should have figured out who your C3PAO is, and you schedule, you go in, and then if everything comes out clean, like your pre-assessment, great. Now you have to manage and maintain. If you have issues, you're going to have to address it. And those who you address it with should be whatever partner organization help you build it. You want to make sure that in order to get this done quickly, you're going right to the expertise, getting it done, and then getting back in line to get that assessment done. I know I covered a lot of stuff in there. I think I've got the majority of your questions there, Colin. Is there anything else?
No, I think that covered the full gamut. There's one more question, but we can save it for the end after the last slide.
Okay. Moving to the top here. This is bubbled to the top quite a bit, actually. As we do these engagements, and as CoreTech is actually out supporting C3PAOs, it's not uncommon for us to be engaged with a mutual customer. Like I said, we're partnered with several of the big C3PAOs out there, and as they're doing pre-assessments, oftentimes we get engaged early on so that we can help the assessor and the customer understand the environment, make sure that they're all speaking the same language when they're going through the assessment. The whole idea is that customers may not necessarily be technology experts or be able to translate some of the questions from the assessment practitioner or the auditor into something they would understand. So it's not uncommon for us to get involved in that process. And also, sometimes we get involved because maybe there's a specific platform. So maybe there's an assessment going on and the customer ultimately wants, an Azure expert MSP. They want that organization that understands how they operate within the Microsoft ecosystem or as a service provider or what have you. We become that liaison, we help through the process. And then coming out of it, as the technologist, we help put together, taking a look at the assessment findings, we help the customer really put together the path forward to address some of the technology findings, the process findings, things of that nature. We can help with the full gamut. What we found going through all of that is certain things bubble to the top. One, getting your partners early and engaged. I know there's a cost to it, but it will save you time and effort in the long run. That's something that happens with the most successful implementations. Secondly, you need to properly scope your CMMC applicability. Reason I bring that up again is that's probably one of the most overlooked item I've seen. Some people, they're too small, but oftentimes they're just way too big. I've seen organizations where I'm trying to figure out, why are you applying these requirements to systems that have no CUI, don't come near CUI, completely out of bounds. You've made the scope so large, it is going to be incredibly expensive and very daunting to address, let alone have it done by 2025. So that's the biggest thing I gut check on anything that comes through is, did you properly scope it? And then your pre-assessment, give me an idea of how much work is in there. If you come back with a sprinkling of things that are easy to fix, let's fix them. If it comes back with major structural problems in your program, missing policies, processes, procedures, like I have a whole practice around that. I have partners with a whole practice around it. Get your person lined up, get them in and get that fixed up front. That will save a lot. And then the technology, that's a whole nother, landscape. As mentioned earlier, there are those that can assess and they can maybe help with the program. And then there's going to be those organizations that can help fix the technology and security problems. If you don't have if you don't have the expertise in-house from a technical perspective, or the amount of available time of your resources, definitely reach out to an RPO, right? CoreTech is an RPO. This is part of what we do. There are many RPOs out there. They're in the CMMC marketplace. Find one that you can work with. One of your partners may already be in that space. The other piece of advice is you want to work with a assessment company, a C3PAO, that knows how to work with an RPO. The reason being is that when you have all of those teams working together as part of that pre-assessment or the assessment, it is much easier, faster, and less expensive to address any gaps found. And also, if there are gaps found, if your RPO, your partner organization that understands your tech or your environment, may be able to translate things from one party to the other, thus possibly avoiding a finding. The assessor is asking things in a certain way, the customer answers what they believe is right, but at the end of the day, it doesn't match, that's a finding. Your RPO, who knows your environment, knows your technologies, knows how all of this fits together, may be able to translate and say, this is how that control is being covered. And that might be the difference between a pass or a fail. The last area is when it comes to how people are making this happen, as they scope things down, it makes sense that if you get it to the point where you can do a bite-sized chunk, that's where an enclave comes in. Get yourself something ready-made, proven, get your data systems people in there and start working in a CMMC compliant way in weeks, not months to years, because 2025 is not that far away. And for much larger organizations, where maybe it's a business unit or the full organization, people are like, well, how does that work with an enclave? The answer is it works similarly, it's just the scale's different. In an enclave, it's ready to go package and it's an architecture. So if I need to scale that up, it scales in a very structured and an expected way. We're right now migrating several incredibly large organizations that have merged and have to come under the CMMC guidances. And for them, after doing a very extensive pre-assessment of their organization, their technology, people, and processes, it made more sense to create the new environment, which for them is multi-cloud. It is structured. There's a lot of moving parts, but moving to that environment where the systems are hardened coming out of the gate and everything is set up compliant, secure, they found that as the only way to success, because it'll do a couple things. One, things that can come over and be reinvented in that new secure manner will be able to stay secure going forward. So you set a line in the sand and it'll move forward. The few things that cannot be rebuilt in that secure environment can be moved into a very specific area. There's a program put in place to migrate off of that, but the environment around it is CMMC compliant. The last piece, which I thought was very interesting, is that when talking to the security practitioners, they found that having this as a full wind in their sail to get the organization to move to more secure baselines, configurations, and technologies and platforms, they've always had to fight very niche, very strategic, very tactical, very niche fights, movements, programs. They're always trying to move the bar a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. This initiative and how structured and well understood, especially when it came to the platforms within a ready-to-go environment, they were able to, for the least amount of effort, the most optimized amount of money, be able to get the most bang for their money, bang for their effort in security and compliance than if they had tried to fix their disparate systems, platforms, and data centers in place. And the response I've gotten on multiple projects like this is it would have never happened if there hadn't been that spark, that epoch moment that forced this conversation. And then the last piece, you can't do it alone. Most organizations just really can't. So really look at who are your service providers today. Will they be able to help you through this journey? Will they also be getting certified in CMMC so they can help you going forward? And if you don't have those service providers, you should look into it, because often after something like this is built, there's a lot of additional overhead, administrative overhead. There's a lot of things that continue on. We're finding organizations really leaning into moving into a service provider to take over those tasks so that internal people can continue forward with internal strategic tasks for the organization.
So, Brian, there's two questions as we wrap up here. One, I believe, was already answered, and one relates to that last point you just made. The first one, just to kind of tick the box, do CMMC requirements flow down to any subcontractors? And I believe the answer is yes, if there is in-scope data that flows down to those contractors.
You are correct, sir.
Okay, and then the second one, kind of to the point you were just talking about, is what is the process just generally for going through a pre-assessment? How do I know I'm ready for that? And what do I need to expect to provide the pre-assessor in terms of access to IT systems and just general information for them to give a valid pre-assessment?
That is a big question. Ultimately, the assessments are available online. In other words, it's all based on 800-171. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to be able to give access to your policies, procedures. You're going to have to go through the control set of 800-171. When it comes to technologies and platforms, it's going to be up to the assessor how far they go down the road into checking the environment and the technology. Sometimes they may ask for evidence to be pulled by your own team. Some may be using a governance, risk, and compliance tool to maybe pull some of that data automatically. It depends on the assessor. The recommendation
probably
is
the assessor and your scope of compliance that you need to map to, like how much of your business handles that data, which goes to their second point, is like how long will that take, kind of shooting at the 2025 timeline, and how long do they need to carve out? I would say get to it as soon as possible, but it really all depends on how deep they're going to go, how mature you are currently, as well as how big your business is and how much of that maps to these requirements. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. And realize the pre-assessment, a lot of people are like, I have to get ready for the pre-assessment. No, you have to get a pre-assessment.
Right. The pre-assessment is going to give you your roadmap to what you really need to work on to get the final assessment to pass.
Exactly. So people who push off the pre-assessment aren't actually doing themselves a service.
I think for anybody watching this or listening live or in the future, I think our resounding message is get that done as quickly as possible, no matter how far you are, so you can get a very detailed roadmap on what your gap to full assessment is, and then you can start prioritizing and working with RPOs and your own internal staff to prepare for your assessment.
Exactly. All right, that's time, Colin. I know we went right up to the edge on that one. So
yeah, pretty good.
Great questions. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time. I would definitely recommend some of the follow-up sessions. They get a little bit more into the weeds of the technologies and platforms and how do you put the whole solution together.
Thanks all.